Welcome to the Profile Corner. In today's video, we will be taking the boards that were surface floor sides in the last video and building a plywood cart from those oak boards. I've gone through the material list trying to find ways that I can reduce the weight of this cart so that I don't overload the casters that'll be used at the bottom of the cart. These are the same casters that I'm using on this workbench. They're 3 inches tall. They come with a set of metric size bolts, but I won't be able to use these. And so what I'll be using instead are number 12 1.5 screws, along with some 1/4 inch washers to hold these casters in place. So I've come up with a new material list that'll hopefully decrease the total weight of the cart and make it a little bit less top heavy. So I need to get started by laminating some of these boards so that they're 1.5 inches thick for the base. So I'll get started with that by cutting these to rough length over at the radial arm saw, and then we'll get those glued up so that the glue has time to set up before we need to use those boards. The 4 boards that I've got here will be used for the base, so I need to cut these down to 61 inches for a rough length. I'll square up the one end first, and then I'll cut them to 61 inches. Next up, I need to cut some boards that'll be the cross pieces on the base. They need to be 13.5 inches long once they're finished up, so I'll cut them to 14.5 inches. I'm able to get 3 of the 4 boards that I'll need out of the offcuts off the last boards that were just cut. The last board had some area down here that didn't get cleaned up at the planer, and that's going to be a little bit short of the desired length. So I can't use this board. So what I'll do instead is I'll use a section of this board here. It has some non-cleanup down here on this end, but because this board is only going to end up being 3 inches wide, I'll actually be able to eliminate that area of non-cleanup, and so I should be able to take the 14.5 inches that I need out of this section down through here. Board ended up getting cut too short. I saw a mark right here, and I thought that was my mark. The mark was actually back here, so I ended up ruining that board. And maybe I'll use that for something else later on in the project. I can't use this board because this area here is going to cause a defect in the mortise and tenon joint that we'll be trying to create later on. So I think what I'll do is I'll just cut another board. Okay, it's got more of a defect right through here, some bug damage, so I want to get rid of that. And now I want to cut these boards down to the approximate width over at the table saw so I don't waste quite as much glue as I would otherwise when I'm gluing these boards up. So I've got all the boards oriented so that the edge of the board that I want to keep is the furthest away from the blade, so that when I bring it into the rip fence area here, it ends up keeping that area of the board. I've got the rip fence right now set to 4 1/4 inches wide, which will be a 1/4 inch wider than I need these boards to end up at, so that once the glue dries up on these boards, I can then clean them up at the jointer and also on the table saw to get them to the right width. The next set of boards need to be cut to 3 inches wide. Okay, so now we can head over to the workbench to get these glued up. Now I have the boards oriented in the way they'll be glued up. I'll be gluing up both sets at the same time. And while it looks like I've got quite a few clamps here, this is probably not actually enough clamps to apply enough pressure, because I'll probably end up needing an additional clamp in between all the way down. And so I've got some Jorgensen F-style clamps to be used in between. So let's go ahead and let's get started here. This is going to be a time-consuming glue up, so I'll be speeding up the video footage. get the shorter boards glued up the same way, and then we can let this set for a couple hours, and then I can scrape off the glue. I may only allow it to set for about an hour and a half before I try to scrape off the excess glue. I didn't get quite as much squeeze out on this section here as what I was expecting. I've got good squeeze out on the other end. Hopefully this end is not glue starved. I was running just a little bit short on glue, so I was trying to conserve it a little bit. I'll always have one more clamp than what you need. While the glue up is curing, let's cut some boards to 3 inches wide. There'll be quite a few boards that need to be 3 inches wide in this project. I don't think I want to cut all the boards just yet to that width, but I'll cut up quite a few of these so that we're ready to go on to the next step in the project once the glue cures. Okay, now we can head over to the radial arm saw and start cutting these to final length. The first two boards I need to cut are the upper boards on the side. They need to be cut to 60 inches long. Next, I need to cut 10 upright boards to 62 inches long. So what I'll do is I'll square up this end, and then I'll cut this board to 62 inches long, and then I'll use it to set a stop block on the other radial arm saw so that I can get all the other boards at exactly the same length. The upper back board is the last board I need to cut right now. It needs to be cut to 13.5 inches long. So next up, what I need to do is run all the boards through the wide drum sander to make sure that they're all at exactly the same thickness, which is 3/4 of an inch. And then once I do that, it'll be time to start cutting the mortise and tenon joints. Okay, let's joint the edge of the glue ups now. And now I'll run these boards through the thickness planer to bring them down to exactly 1.5 inches thick. Some of these are 2/100ths of an inch thicker than 1.5 inches. And so it's most efficient to do that over at the planer to bring it down to the right size. I'll do that off camera. The two short boards here need to be cut to 3 inches wide. And since I still have the saw set up for 3 inches wide, I can go ahead and make that cut now. The longer boards back here need to be cut to 4 inches wide. So I'll do that after I get done cutting these. Now we can start working on the mortise and tenon joints after I cut all these boards to their final length over at the radial arm saw. I'll do that off camera. I'm just in the process of laying out the locations of the mortise and tenon joints. Here I've got the glued up boards down here on the bottom. I'll be putting a 3/4 inch long tenon on this board. It'll be a 1/2 inch thick. And of course there'll be a corresponding mortise going into these boards on both ends. This board right here and this board are the top rail. They'll be suspended up into the air vertically with these boards running up to them. So this board on the bottom will have a 1/2 inch wide tenon on it. That's 1.5 inches long, and that'll be offset so that this actually appears right in this area here on the inside, so that the inside is flush, and so that 1/2 inch wide tenon will be on this side. So this side here will be about a 1/4 inch cutout, and there may be about a 32nd of an inch that I'll leave out here on this edge right here when I create these tenons. And obviously I'll have to cut the mortise into these boards the same way. I'll have 5 of these uprights on each side. I'll space them out equally, and what I've done is I've gone through and I've numbered these. This is set number 2. These boards do not look quite as nice as the boards that are in set number 1, and so I figured what I would do is I'd have this set pushed up against the wall, and so this will be corresponding with this side right here, and then I can have that set number 1 corresponding with this side. Okay, so I still have to lay out the exact spacing to get 5 of these boards located equally spaced along the length. So I'll do that next, and then I'll bring out the horizontal pantograph, and then we can start making these mortise and tenon joints using that tool. I should also mention, on the top of these boards, this side right here, I'll be making 1.5 inch long tenon that's 3/8 of an inch thick, and that'll be centered on this board. There's lots of ways to create mortise and tenon joints, as I've shown in previous videos. Today I'll be using the horizontal pantograph. I've got it set up right now so to cut a hole that's a little bit over 3/4 of an inch deep, and I'll be going up roughly 2 inches from the bottom point. I'm using a 2-inch template here, and so I think we're ready to get started now. That cut is complete. It was made without having the dust collection turned on. I'll get the next board loaded up onto here using the same stop block, and then we'll cut another one. Okay, I've got the next board installed on here. I've installed the dust collection boot. I've got a long 2-inch cutting length bit installed in here. So the brush is not quite long enough for that, but I think that'll be okay. Okay, now I'm ready to cut the mortise on the other end. Okay, now for the last of the challenging ones. And now I'm getting ready to cut the first tenon. I'll cut it without the dust brush installed, just so that it's easier for you to see what's happening. check it to see if it's the right width. I'm shooting for a 1/2 inch. It's about 3/1000ths over a 1/2 inch. So that wouldn't fit into a 1/2 inch wide mortise. So I need to make this a little bit narrower. That's exactly a 1/2 inch. I'm going to go just ever so slightly smaller than that, but there's a little bit of room for the glue. That's about 1/1000ths under. I'm actually targeting about 3/1000ths under. That may have been just a little bit too much. Let's see what we get. That's about 4/1000ths under, 5/1000ths under. So that should fit. Yeah, and that'll fit. Okay, so then I need to do the other ones the same way. use the 7/32 inch setup block to set this 1/2 inch router bit off the table here to set the height. And what that should do is give me a 32nd of an inch on the opposite side of the tenons when I go to cut those. I'll be cutting this mortise 1.5 inches deep, actually just a little bit over that. So here's the mortise that was cut. As you can see, it was cut into the right spot, so that there should be about a 32nd of an inch before this seam between the two 3/4 inch boards that were glued together. So now I just need to repeat that process going down roughly over 15 inches to continue cutting those mortises. I'll probably only show a couple more of those getting cut on this unit, and then when we switch over to cutting the tenons, I'll show you a couple of those getting cut also. I'm ready to cut the first tenon. On this top section here, it should only take off about a 32nd of an inch. After I make the cut, I'll have to do a quick measurement and see if I'm at a 1/2 inch for the tenon size. It's about 1/1000th oversize, so I'll have to make it a little bit smaller. I'm going to go for about 3/1000ths under. That's about 5/1000ths under. That should work. cut the rest of those off camera. Next, I need to cut some 3/8 inch thick tenons that are 1.5 inches long. I've already got this set up so that it should cut at exactly 3/8 of an inch minus 5 thousandths. So we should be all set, ready to go. I'll cut the rest of them off camera. This is the upper board that'll go on to the back side, that'll run between the two sides of the unit. I only need a 3/8 inch thick tenon here that'll also be 3/8 of an inch deep. I'm ready to cut the 3/8 inch wide mortises that are 1.5 inches deep into the top rails. Get the mortises cut into the other rail the same way. The last set of mortises will be a 3/8 inch deep, 3/8 inch wide mortise. I've got the depth of cut set about a 1/16 over 3/8 of an inch, so that there's a little bit of clearance at the bottom for some glue. So now we're all set to do the routing. I've got the two boards doubled up that'll get the mortises, one on each side, and that's so that this does not have a tendency to tip. I did test it with a square, and it is square to the table as it's clamped down right now. I had planned to glue up this project and get it finished in this video. However, because it's going to be quite cold for the next couple days, the glue would not actually set up due to the cold temperatures. So I'll have to wait a couple days to get this glued up. So this is going to end part 2. Part 3 will show the assembly and the final install with the plywood installed onto the cart, and hopefully the cart does not tip over if it becomes too top heavy. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.